Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 9, in what feels like a pivotal moment in the war. We're going to start by looking at several articles from the Moscow Times. This time, they deal with things that have happened which you can't fail to have missed in the media if you're following the war closely. The first one from the 30th of May of this year, Moscow hit by a swarm of drones in a wartime first. Moscow was targeted by a swarm of drones early Tuesday morning, marking the first time that unmanned aerial vehicles have struck residential areas of the Russian capital since the country's full scale of invasion last year. This is an absolutely pivotal moment because psychologically, this is no longer just on people's TV screens. These drones have been seen 1,000 kilometers away from Ukraine in the capital, Moscow. The drone attack is supposed to have caused minor damage to several buildings. Are people worried? One of the first reactions is that these drones have flown over the areas of the rich and powerful. And in some ways, Russians are not going to care a huge amount about what happens to their overlords. And this makes it an incredibly clever strategy by the Ukrainians, because undoubtedly these have been orchestrated by the Ukrainians. And they're targeting a segment of the Russian population which ordinary Russians will not feel a huge amount of sympathy for. The attack on Moscow comes as Russia's armed forces brace for an imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive, and it follows weeks of Russian attacks on the Ukrainian capital of Kiev that have involved hundreds of missiles and drones. And when we see the panic in Moscow over a small number of very lightly armed drones, we have to compare this to what the Russians have been doing to Ukraine. Later in this clip, I'm going to try and bring all these articles together and provide a short analysis and a long set of opinions on what this all means. Apparently, Vladimir Putin was informed of the drone attack in real time. One can only speculate, though, as to whether he was given the full story by his minions and sycophants. Dmitry Peskov reacted to these attacks and said that they were a reaction by the Kiev regime because of Russia's effective strikes on command and control centers in Ukraine. Well, anyone watching the footage will know that Russian missiles largely have been hitting residential areas and killing civilians. But no one believes what Peskov or any of the others say these days, I think, at least not outside of Russia. The second article is another story which really has grabbed the imagination of anyone watching this conflict unfold. And that, again, is from the Moscow Times, and it is images of the war that is now creeping closer to Russia's Belgorod and Kursk regions. As the war in Ukraine enters its 16th month, Russian regions on the country's southwestern border have found themselves pulled ever deeper into the conflict, experiencing shelling, drone attacks, and even armed incursions. And again, this is an incredible psychological blow. Ukrainians have created these incursions undoubtedly, using Russians who are disaffected with the Russian regime. And even though these forces are clearly equipped by the Ukrainians, quite likely managed in some way by them, there is plausible deniability that Ukraine is actually orchestrating them. And that is really playing Moscow's psychological game back on it. And these attacks, these incursions, have also revealed that the Russian border regions are unable to ensure the security of their own territory and their own people. This is a significant psychological blow. The Belgorod and Kursk regions, both neighboring Ukraine, have been subject to intensified attacks in recent weeks as Kiev prepares for a major counteroffensive against Russian forces. And this is the clear strategic reason. It ticks a number of different boxes. It embarrasses the regime. It seeks to drive a split between local governors and the central government. It unnerves ordinary Russians because the war is now no longer just a TV spectacle, but also it forces Moscow to reinforce the domestic front, which has been left woefully unprotected. That, of course, means there'll be fewer Russian forces to counter Ukraine's attack when it comes. It means also that important materiel and equipment may also be diverted from the front line in order to shore up domestic security. And how is Putin reacting to all of this? Well, the article on May the 26th by Tatiana Stanovaya suggests that actually Putin's reaction, which is pretending really this doesn't happen, not really taking any decisive actions, that this could absolutely backfire at home. So Putin's gone from secretly micromanaging the war effort, making a number of appalling decisions over the last year and a half, doing micromanaged photo opportunities, for instance, opening a tram line in the occupied Ukrainian city of Mariupol. But when real presidential initiatives are required, when real strategic action is required to counter Ukrainian orchestrated incursions into Russia, Putin seems to be curiously absent from the limelight. It suggests that he is not adapting himself, he's thinking or the country to this new wartime reality as the violence spills over from Ukraine and starts to take place on Russian territory. And Putin has remained stubbornly disengaged from what's happening. To an extent, he's left his minions to try and tackle it. He's left the propagandists to try and create credible narratives. But in fact, as we'll see from the Clown World segment later in this episode, it's having the opposite effect. Propagandists are turning on each other in an increasingly vicious cycle of recriminations, and Prigozhin seems to be going off script almost every day. What does that mean for the regime in Russia? Well, repression has deepened in an attempt at self-preservation by a system that is brittle and unresponsive amid a fast-growing geopolitical risk and, of course, fears of defeat in the war that Russia started. As part of this repressive machine, we see the return to ideology, the return to things that might have worked under the Soviet Union, but are unlikely to spur the population into action, are unlikely to convince millions of people to join the army and sacrifice their lives in Ukraine for the motherland. But this process, this war, this outpouring of violence that Putin began has long ceased to be something that is under his direct control. And it is now developing independently of him. And that might partially explain his inaction and, to some extent, confusion and inability to counter Ukraine's strategies, narratives, and deflections of the violence back onto Russia itself. And we see this increasing desperation in another story from the Moscow Times, this time dated 29th of May, and that is Russia firing missiles on Kiev in a rare daytime attack. Russia fired a barrage of missiles at Kiev on Monday, sending panicked residents running for shelter in an unusual daytime attack on the Ukrainian capital, following a pattern over the last couple of months of conducting overnight raids during the darkness. Of course, nighttime raids have the effect of depriving people of sleep, unnerving them, and forcing them to live under these kind of siege conditions. However, it hasn't stopped Ukrainians from working and functioning, and it may well be that this daytime raid was a way to try and up psychological pressure. It could also, equally cynically, have been a way for the drone and missile attacks to create footage that could be used by propagandists and are designed for the Western media to distribute, because increasingly the nighttime attacks were getting less and less coverage in the press. But authorities said that Ukrainian air defenses had downed every Russian missile launched against the Kiev region. And that must be unnerving the Kremlin, because even their most advanced missiles, including Iskander-M and Iskander-K, and the so-called hypersonic missiles, it seems that these are not living up to the hype, and they're not able to get through Ukraine's air defenses. This also destroys Russia's image of invincibility and of their superior military technology. In short, it's an embarrassment for the Kremlin. And here's an interesting take on this subject from Svitlana Morenets in The Spectator, dated the 22nd of May. And I think this is the story that we're going to really sort of unpack in more detail in the opinion piece that comes at the end of this video. And our article is entitled, "Has Ukraine Launched a Special Military Operation in Russia?" While the world is waiting for Ukraine's spring offensive, something very different happened this morning, an incursion into Russian territory. The soldiers involved are not from the Ukrainian army, but 2 legions of exiled Russians, including soldiers who defected from the Russian armed forces. They are, as we've said, allied with Ukraine. They are probably supplied by Ukraine. They may even be trained up to the same standards as the Ukrainian army, but are not officially part of Kiev's military command. That doesn't mean, however, that their actions are not coordinated by the Ukrainian secret services. This is something that perhaps only in the fullness of time will we really know how these attacks have been engineered and managed. And taking all these stories together, from the drone attacks to the insurgents, it's clear this is causing an unprecedented level of concern, not just amongst propagandists and military hierarchy, but also starting to penetrate into civilian conversation as well. In the description to this video, I'll put further links to an excellent article by Mark Galeotti, also published in The Spectator, about the truth behind the drone attacks. And this includes the story of the drone attack on the Kremlin as well, which is looking increasingly likely that that was a Ukrainian operation too, although it also has the same plausible deniability that they are seeking to use in this hybrid warfare. Well, what has been the reaction in clan world? And one of the most telling segments is from Solovyov's show, where State Duma member Andrei Gurylyov threatened another expert on the panel, Dmitry Abzalov, because he asserted that he doesn't want to die in a nuclear war. During wartime, those who panic get shot on the spot. You may not live long enough to see nuclear war, he seems to threaten his fellow panelists. This and many other incidences suggest that there is a degree of anxiety and panic amongst the propagandists. They've also started openly discussing what might get prosecuted in The Hague and speculating as to whether propagandists, genocide inciting propagandists, as we believe they are, whether they will also come within The Hague's activities and remit. And staying in clan world, another absolutely absurd segment that came to light and is reported by Julia Davis on her excellent Russian media monitor. That is also on Vladimir Solovyov's show. And one of his guests, Professor Dmitry Evstafiev, argued that the West wants to divide Russia by promising to supply its regions with Nutella, paved roads, and indoor toilets, as if those 3 things are absolutely the worst aspect of imperial Western civilization. That smacks of a certain level of desperation, I think. Who can argue that these things are not actually a benefit? It's also perhaps a tacit admission of the state of Russian civilization. If flushing indoor toilets, paved roads, and a hazelnut chocolate snack can be considered the height of luxury. Well, let's move on from clown world into the opinion piece that I mentioned earlier in the segment. Well, it feels like the last few weeks have been a real turning point when the war came to Russian soil. Now it's no longer just a spectacle on TV. It's not just fodder for the genocidal propagandists. For the Russian population, apathy and indifference are not enough now. Forgetfulness or passive acquiescence is not an option. Your country needs you, Russia. So the options are fight or flight. And many Russians will now be faced, as never before, with these stark choices. And it seems also that everything in the war is inverted. From the start, where Ukraine apparently wasn't real, at least that was the Russian assertion of the propagandists and underpinning the invasion itself, to a position where perhaps Russia itself doesn't exist, or at least it doesn't seem to have defendable borders. We went from NATO being an existential threat to NATO expansion really not mattering. Sweden, Finland, have now joined the fold. But when that red line was crossed, did Russia care? It seemed not to. And if NATO was the real threat to Russia, why have Russia's borders become so porous, so undefended? Why were there not more troops and equipment on those borders if NATO was a real threat? As ever, in Russia, it's actions, not words, that count. Force, not negotiation, is what Moscow looks to. And this war has shown that Putin's Russia is a brittle regime. The war started in some ways because of a lack of flex in the system. It started because there was no succession planning, no way for a successor to Putin to rise and take over in a peaceful fashion. That problem of inheritance lies at the very heart of the collapse that we are now seeing in the Russian system. And what is Ukraine doing? Ukraine is leveraging this weakness, leveraging the brittle nature of Russia's regime to break it, potentially even as a shortcut to end the war. Russia can be seen as a vertical of thieves. From the top down, it's a system that is designed to allow people to skim off money. It's institutionalized thievery. And the problem now comes because we have a generation that needs to pass that on to its successors, to turn a society of first-generation thieves into a system where this thievery can be inherited by their offspring. And this is where it is falling apart. And we see this vertical of thieves and thievery also being expressed in the way Russians treat each other. In particular, we're talking here about the political classes. They seem to be motivated by the worst characteristics and in this imperative to pass on their ill-gotten gains, their wealth, and their influence to their children. But what they all understand is that if you lose that battle, your successors, the thieves that take your stuff, can rewrite your history. That there is no objective truth, there is no objective history. Everything in Russia is subservient to power. So if you lose your place in this hierarchy, you not only lose your wealth and influence and status, but also history will be rewritten once you lose that power, influence, and control. And you may be written out of that history, or your role in that history may be completely fabricated by those who come after you. The actions of the insurgents and the drone attacks have also shown that Russia has no real borders. Ukraine's use of plausible deniability, the little blue men that it sent back into Russia, is a real reversal of the hybrid information warfare and psyops which Russia has been using against Ukraine for 9 years. But Ukraine is smart. It seems to be better at Moscow's modus operandi than Moscow is itself. It's taken the approach of returning coals to Newcastle, returning extremists back to the country that created them, to Russia. Extreme nationalists, anarchists, nihilists, and maybe some good people too, being organized and injected back into the body politic of Russia. Ukraine is rendering unto the Third Rome that which belongs to the bunker Caesar. But is it effective to use zombies to fight other zombies? No, Ukraine's strategy has to be more than that. It has to ensure that the Russian insurgency plays a role in reducing Ukrainian casualties during the upcoming counteroffensive and increases the chances of that counteroffensive being successful. And what's unfolding now also shows that going from a position of Ukraine not being real, Ukraine not existing, it shows that Russia does not exist in the sense it's not an organic identity. It's not an emergent property from history and culture and the people. It's not being shaped and reformed continuously, but the Russian national identity, the Russian political identity is a manufactured one from top down. It's an imperial identity, and the cracks in it are starting to show. And what's fascinating about the Belgorod raids is this realization that you could actually hack bits of Russia off and no one would really notice. For anyone watching the 1420 channel, it's been absolutely revelatory. People in Moscow and the surrounding areas are really asked about what they think of the Belgorod incursions. And the conclusion, it's a long way away and almost nobody cares what happens there. It suggests that Russians that are far away from Belgorod and the border feel no affinity, feel no empathy to those that are coming under fire, those that are being forced to flee their villages. It's as if this only becomes real if people can see it and touch it in their own residential areas. And that, of course, is what Ukraine is doing with its drone attacks on Moscow. What we've also realized as well is that far from being a master strategist, Putin is more like an automaton. He won't stop until he's stopped. He's a rogue agent following his programming with no ability to deviate from it. He's a bit like a body's immune system that's run amok. The Secret Service agent that was supposed to protect the regime is now destroying it from the inside. He's a parasite, now consuming healthy flesh and putting the whole organism at risk. But we also have to address the outbreak of moral concern and outrage, the fear and anxiety that Ukraine's attacks in Russia seem to be provoking in some quarters. Somehow, this is seen as an escalation, whereas a year and a half of Russia bombing apartments, energy infrastructure, threatening nuclear facilities, that is not an escalation. But when Ukraine fights back, it is. We seem comfortable with Ukraine being noble victims, turning their cheek in the rubble of their apartments, their hospitals, their kindergartens, and their museums. We have forced them to fight with their hands tied behind their backs. If it was not for nuclear weapons, would anyone be holding them back? Would we care, in fact, what Ukraine did to Russia? I don't think we would. And will Ukraine's actions in Moscow and Belgrade affect the supply of Western weapons? I hope it won't, because Ukraine is doing what it needs to do to win, and it needs to win in order to survive. We shouldn't impose our own wishful thinking onto the various actors in this war. Russian insurgents are not good guys or bad guys, but a complex spectrum of motivations. Navalny does not have to be a saint for him to be useful to Ukraine and the West. Ukraine will do what it needs to do to survive. For them, the lives of Russian freedom fighters may be a lower priority than the lives of Ukrainians. So why should Ukraine not use them strategically? In fact, it would be immoral of Ukraine not to use every means at its disposal, every technique and lever to push back the Russians. Survival for Ukrainians requires a victory. Who are we to judge them for their choices or tie their hands behind their backs with endless conditions and red lines on how the weapons are to be used? And that brings us to some of the recent strategies, the so-called fall of Bakhmut. Again, we want to see these events in black and white. But maybe Russia did not take Bakhmut. Maybe it was ceded in a deal with Prigozhin, contingent on the withdrawal of his forces to allow him to sow division within the Russian hierarchy. I'm not saying this is what's happened. We have no way of knowing, but it's this kind of strategic creativity that Ukraine is exhibiting in other areas. And it's this creativity and inventiveness that will lead to chaos and violence in Russia that potentially collapses the Russian army and ends this war faster. But it may also result in internecine warfare in Russia. Not a civil war as such, not a civil war of parties and classes against each other, but warlords carving up the spoils. If that's what Ukraine needs to do to win, I have no doubt that they'll do it. If collapsing Belarus and Lukashenko's regime is what they need to do to secure their northern borders, I have no doubt they will do it. And their leaders have a moral imperative to do that because it will save Ukrainian lives in the end. It's Russia's brittle and geriatric political system that led to the war, And Ukraine is using this weakness of the autocratic vertical against Russia. And that may well be what helps the Ukrainian horizontal to triumph. Well, let's end with this idea that everything is becoming inverted, and potentially that means we could be getting closer to the end. From a desire to weaken NATO and Europe, we now see NATO and Europe becoming stronger than ever. From Ukraine not being a real place to it becoming a cornerstone of European security. From an invasion that was apparently to defend the Russian language, which was being suppressed in Ukraine, we are now seeing the voluntary annihilation of Russia within Ukraine as people stop using it actively, because in many cases it's too painful for them to do so. From Russia having no borders to Russia not really existing in its current imperial form. And from the Russian intent to demilitarize Ukraine, it's actually becoming a legendary military power and possibly one of the most powerful armies in Europe. And that's the end of Silicon Bytes episode 9. Do tune in next week when at the current rate, we will have a huge number of stories to cover.